The morning had been moving exactly the way Ava Sinclair liked it. Every meeting was on schedule. Every executive knew where they were supposed to be. Every report waiting on her desk had already been summarized by her assistant before she stepped into the office. Nothing surprised the 38-year-old billionaire CEO anymore. Not investors, not competitors, not market crashes. Running one of America's largest commercial real estate companies had taught her that most problems arrived loudly and left quietly. But some arrived in silence and changed everything. At exactly 9:17 that morning, a thin folder landed on her desk. Custodial department interviews. Her assistant smiled politely. "We're short 2 janitors at the downtown headquarters. HR already narrowed the applicants. These just need your final approval because of the new security policy." Ava almost laughed. A CEO reviewing janitor applications. Normally, she'd never waste time doing it. But after several security incidents inside the building, every employee, even custodial staff, required executive authorization. She opened the first folder, nothing unusual. Former warehouse worker, rejected. The second, temporary cleaner, rejected. The third, recently relocated, approved. She kept turning pages without thinking, until one application made her hands stop, not because of the photograph. Not because of the experience, because of one name, Daniel Brooks. She read it again, then again. The office suddenly felt quieter. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan traffic continued flowing as if nothing had happened. Inside her office, time seemed to hesitate. "No." She whispered almost unconsciously. Her assistant looked up. "Is something wrong?" Ava didn't answer. Instead, she kept staring at those 2 words printed neatly across the application. Daniel Brooks. It couldn't be after 20 years. There was no way. She pressed the intercom. "Don't send the next applicant home. Bring Mr. Brooks directly to my office." Her assistant blinked. "The CEO office." "Yes, immediately." 5 minutes later, a man stepped quietly into the room. His work boots were old but carefully polished. His gray maintenance jacket had clearly been washed hundreds of times. He carried a worn leather folder instead of an expensive briefcase. Life had left its fingerprints everywhere on him, except his eyes. Those hadn't changed. Calm, patient. The same steady eyes Ava remembered from another lifetime. He looked around politely before speaking. "Good morning." His voice was gentle, confident without trying to impress anyone. Ava stood. For a moment she completely forgot she was the CEO, forgot the billion-dollar company. Forgot the board meeting waiting upstairs. She simply looked at him, searching, trying to find the young man she had known 20 years earlier inside the face standing before her now. Daniel frowned slightly. "I'm sorry. Have we met before?" A tiny smile appeared on Ava's face. "You really don't remember me." Daniel studied her for another few seconds. Then something changed. His eyes widened just enough. "Ava." She nodded. "Ava Sinclair." He let out a slow breath. "I haven't heard that name in years." Neither spoke for several seconds, not because there was nothing to say, but because neither knew where to begin after 20 years. Finally, Ava gestured toward the chair. "Please. Sit down." Daniel remained standing. "I'd rather stand." She noticed something then. His hands, rough, scarred. The hands of someone who had spent years doing physical labor, not the hands of the brilliant young engineer she remembered from college. Not the man every professor believed would one day design America's tallest skyscrapers. What happened? How could someone once destined to lead billion-dollar projects now be asking for permission to clean office hallways? Ava looked back at the application. Previous employment, loading docks, night security, building maintenance, warehouse supervisor, temporary construction cleanup. Nothing matched the future everyone had once predicted for him. She looked up carefully. "Daniel, I have to ask, you graduated at the top of one of the best engineering programs in the country. You had companies competing to hire you. So," her voice softened, "why are you applying for a janitor position?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the giant windows overlooking the city. For a long moment, he simply watched thousands of people rushing through lives that never seemed to slow down. When he finally spoke, his words carried no self-pity, no anger, only quiet acceptance. "Because sometimes life doesn't ask what you're capable of. It only asks what you're willing to sacrifice." Ava felt something tighten in her chest. She realized this interview was no longer about hiring a janitor. It was about uncovering the story of a man who had disappeared 20 years ago, and she had no idea. That the biggest secret Daniel Brooks was hiding wasn't about why he had fallen. It was about what he had quietly given up, so someone else could rise. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the kind that only exists between two people carrying 20 years of unanswered questions. Ava slowly closed the application folder. I never thought I'd see you again. Daniel offered a small smile. Neither did I. She leaned back in her chair. When graduation ended, you disappeared. No goodbye. No emails. No calls. You were just gone. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. Sometimes leaving quietly hurts fewer people. That answer only deepened the mystery. It sounded less like an explanation, and more like a man who had spent years convincing himself it was true. Ava folded her hands together. Daniel, this isn't an HR interview anymore. I just want the truth. He nodded slowly. I figured you would. Outside the office, employees hurried through the executive hallway carrying coffee cups and laptops, completely unaware that behind the CEO's closed door sat a man whose life had once looked destined for greatness. Ava looked down at his resume again. Every job lasted 1 or 2 years. Different cities, different companies, no promotions, no career progression, almost as if every time life gave him a chance to climb. Something forced him back down, then she noticed something else. Under emergency contact, only one name appeared. Emily Brooks, daughter, age 12, no spouse, no parents, no siblings, just one little girl. Ava looked up. You have a daughter. Daniel's face changed instantly, for the first time since entering the office. His eyes softened. She's my whole world. Ava smiled. How old? 12. What does she like? Daniel chuckled quietly. Books. Too many books. She thinks every library should stay open 24 hours. Ava laughed. It was the first genuine laugh she'd had all week. Then she noticed something. Whenever he talked about himself, his voice stayed flat. But whenever he mentioned his daughter, life returned to his face. Whatever had happened to Daniel Brooks, that little girl was the reason he kept moving forward. A soft knock interrupted them. Ava's assistant stepped inside. The board meeting starts in 10 minutes. Ava didn't even look up. Reschedule it. The assistant blinked. Ma'am, the investors flew in from Chicago. I said reschedule it. Yes, ma'am. As the door closed, Daniel looked surprised. You didn't have to do that. I know, but I wanted to. He shook his head. You always were stubborn. She smiled. I learned from the best engineering student our university ever had. Daniel laughed quietly. I don't think the professors would agree anymore. Ava's expression grew serious. They would if they knew the truth. He looked away. They don't need to. Meanwhile, across the building, Vice President Richard Hale watched through the glass wall of the executive floor. He had been with Sinclair Properties for almost 15 years. Smart, ambitious, respected, but also deeply protective of his authority. When he saw the CEO cancel a board meeting for a janitor applicant, his curiosity quickly became suspicion. He called HR. Who is that man? Minutes later, the file landed in his inbox. He skimmed it, then laughed under his breath. A maintenance applicant. He looked again toward Ava's office. What exactly are you hiding? A Mr. Brooks. Inside the office, Ava stood and walked toward the massive window overlooking Manhattan. You remember my father? Daniel became quiet. Of course. He was always kind to me. She nodded. He admired you. He used to say you'd build buildings that would still be standing 100 years after we were gone. Daniel smiled sadly. He gave me more credit than I deserved. No, he didn't. She turned toward him. The last thing Dad ever told me before he passed away was to never forget the man who taught him that integrity matters more than success. Daniel looked genuinely confused. I never taught your father anything. Ava held his eyes. That's because he never told you. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? She walked to an old wooden cabinet in the corner of her office. From inside, she carefully removed a small leather notebook. Its edges were worn, its pages yellowed with time. My father kept journals. After he died, I found your name. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. My name. He wrote about one afternoon, 22 years ago, the day an engineering firm offered you a 6-figure job before graduation. Daniel slowly nodded. I remember. He also wrote that you turned it down. Daniel's expression froze. Ava watched him carefully. My father asked why. You told him. She opened the journal. That another graduate needed the position more because his wife was expecting their first child. Daniel stared at the floor. He hadn't heard that story in decades. My father offered to recommend you somewhere else. You refused. You said. Ava looked directly into his eyes. If I'm good enough, another opportunity will come. If he loses this one, his family loses everything. Daniel slowly closed his eyes. I'd forgotten I ever said that. No, Ava whispered, you forgot. My father never did. She gently closed the notebook. That man built one of the largest construction companies in Texas. He later sold it. He became a multimillionaire. He funded scholarships. He created hundreds of jobs. He spent his entire life believing that one stranger gave his family a future. Daniel sat speechless. I never even knew. You weren't supposed to. Ava smiled softly. That's exactly why Dad admired you. At that exact moment, Richard Hale quietly lowered the phone he'd been using outside the office. He hadn't heard every word, but he'd heard enough, and one thought immediately crossed his mind. If the CEO had a personal connection with this applicant, everything inside the company was about to change. Everything inside the company was about to change. Daniel Brooks started work the following Monday. There was no special welcome, no announcement, no reserved parking spot, no executive privileges, just a gray maintenance uniform, a security badge, a ring of keys, and a utility cart. Exactly what he had asked for. As he buttoned his work shirt in the locker room, another janitor smiled. First day. Daniel nodded, yeah. The older man held out his hand. I'm Frank. Been here almost 18 years. Daniel shook it. Daniel, Frank chuckled, rule number 1. If nobody notices your work, you're doing it right. Daniel smiled. I can live with that. By 6:30 every morning, Daniel had already cleaned the executive lobby. Every trash bin was empty, every glass door spotless. Every marble floor reflected the morning sunlight. He never rushed. He never complained. He simply worked. The security guards began greeting him every morning. The receptionist smiled when he walked by. The cafeteria staff learned he always ordered the cheapest breakfast. And every afternoon, at exactly 3:15, he left the building for 20 minutes, never 21, never 19. Exactly 20. No one knew why. Across the hall, Richard Hale noticed everything. He had built his career by studying people, patterns, habits, weaknesses, and Daniel Brooks was unlike anyone he'd ever seen. A man with an engineering degree, working as a janitor, a CEO who personally interviewed him, a mysterious connection to the Sinclair family. None of it made sense. Richard called human resources. Pull every employment record this man has. The HR manager hesitated. So that's confidential. Richard smiled. I'm the executive vice president. Consider it a management review. Later that afternoon, Daniel quietly clocked out for his daily 20-minute break. Instead of heading to the cafeteria, he walked 6 blocks, crossed 2 busy intersections, and entered a small public middle school. He never went inside. He simply waited near the front gate. Exactly 3 minutes later, a 12-year-old girl came running toward him. Dad. Emily threw her backpack onto his shoulder before hugging him tightly. Daniel laughed. Heavy today. She grinned. Science project. They sat together on a nearby park bench. Daniel handed her half of the sandwich he'd packed that morning. She looked at it. You didn't eat again, did you? I had breakfast. She raised one eyebrow. Dad. You always say that. He smiled, and I'm always telling the truth. Emily quietly broke her sandwich in half. Without saying a word, she handed half back to him. I already ate at school. Daniel looked at her. They both knew she was lying. They both knew why. Neither mentioned it. Instead, they shared the sandwich, half for her, half for him, from across the street. A black luxury SUV stopped at a traffic light. Inside sat Ava Sinclair. She had just finished meeting with investors nearby. As the light turned red, she happened to glance toward the park, and froze. She watched Daniel laughing with a little girl. No expensive toys, no fancy restaurant, no complaints. Just a father trying to make 20 minutes feel like an entire afternoon. The traffic light turned green. Cars behind her honked. She didn't move for several seconds. She simply watched. Then she quietly whispered to herself. So that's why. The next morning, Richard Hale called Daniel into his office. Daniel knocked once. You wanted to see me. Richard didn't invite him to sit. Instead, he slowly walked around the room. So, the CEO personally interviews you. She remembers you after 20 years. And somehow, you still choose to mop floors. Daniel answered calmly, I applied for a janitor position. So that's what I'm doing. Richard folded his arms. I don't believe in coincidences. Daniel remained silent. Richard stepped closer. What exactly are you after? Daniel looked confused. I'm here to work. No, Richard said quietly. You're here for something else. I just haven't figured out what. Daniel met his eyes. I've spent my whole life earning things honestly. I'm not starting to cheat now. Richard laughed. We'll see. That afternoon, a sudden storm rolled across Manhattan. Employees rushed toward the elevators as thunder shook the windows. Maintenance received dozens of emergency calls, leaking ceilings, power fluctuations, flooded loading docks. Daniel worked floor after floor without stopping. Around 5:40 p.m., a frightened intern came running down the hallway. Help. Someone's trapped. Everyone turned. The freight elevator stopped. Daniel dropped his mop immediately, without waiting for instructions. He ran. Inside the stalled freight elevator, a maintenance worker had collapsed after suffering what appeared to be a heart attack. The elevator was stuck between floors. Panic spread through the hallway. People shouted over one another. Someone called 911. Someone else searched for building maintenance. Daniel looked at the control panel for only a few seconds. His expression changed. Everyone moved back. A building engineer protested. We have to wait for emergency services. Daniel shook his head. If we wait, he may not have enough time. He removed the emergency access panel. His hands moved with surprising confidence. Not recklessly, professionally. Like someone who had done this before, within less than a minute, the elevator slowly lowered into position. The doors opened. Medical staff rushed in. The unconscious worker was breathing, but barely, as paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher. One of them turned to Daniel. You saved him. Daniel simply nodded. I'm glad we got to him. Then, without waiting for thanks, he quietly picked up his mop and walked back toward the hallway, standing at the far end of the corridor. Ava had witnessed everything. So had dozens of employees for the first time. People weren't looking at Daniel Brooks. As the janitor, they were looking at him, as someone they clearly didn't understand, and Ava realized something. The man standing in the gray uniform wasn't hiding from success. He was hiding from a past. No one in the building had even begun to uncover, and before the week was over, that past would come looking for him by Friday morning. Daniel Brooks had become the most talked-about employee in the entire building. Not because anyone officially announced what had happened, but because offices have their own way of spreading stories. Somebody had seen him rescue a maintenance worker trapped inside the freight elevator. Someone else mentioned that the CEO herself had been watching. Another employee claimed Daniel had once been an engineer. By lunchtime, every version of the story was different. The only thing everyone agreed on was this: the quiet janitor wasn't who he appeared to be. Daniel ignored all of it. He arrived before sunrise, finished his work, ate lunch alone, and left every afternoon at exactly 3:15 to see Emily. Nothing about his routine changed. That consistency fascinated Ava. Most people changed when attention found them. Daniel seemed almost uncomfortable with it. Late Friday afternoon, Ava walked through the maintenance corridor carrying 2 cups of coffee. She found Daniel replacing light bulbs in a conference room. I thought you might need a break. Daniel smiled. You remembered. You still drink your coffee black. He looked surprised. You remembered that? I remember more than you think. They sat quietly near the large windows overlooking the city for several minutes. Neither touched the coffee. Finally, Ava asked, Yesterday, how did you know how to override that elevator? Daniel looked outside. I helped design the emergency evacuation systems. She frowned. For this building. He slowly nodded. No. For buildings like this. Ava stared at him. What does that mean? Daniel took a slow breath. After college, I joined Harrison Structural Engineering. Ava's eyes widened. The Harrison Group. They designed half the skyline. Daniel nodded. I was there 6 years. You never told anyone. There wasn't much reason. Ava leaned forward. Daniel, I've reviewed your resume. It never mentions Harrison. It never mentions engineering. It doesn't mention any professional licenses. He looked down at his coffee. I removed them. Why? Because every interview became the same. What do you mean? They'd ask why someone with that background wanted ordinary work. I'd explain. They'd feel sorry for me. They'd offer jobs I wasn't ready to accept. When I turned them down, they assumed I was unstable. So eventually, I stopped telling people. Ava couldn't believe what she was hearing. You erased your own career. Daniel smiled sadly. I erased expectations. Just then, a young woman rushed into the hallway. Mr. Brooks. Daniel stood immediately. What happened? It's Emily. Your daughter's school called. They said she fainted. Daniel's face lost all color. He didn't ask another question. He ran, without thinking, without grabbing his jacket, without clocking out. Ava followed. I'll drive. 15 minutes later, they arrived at the hospital. Daniel nearly sprinted through the emergency entrance. A nurse stopped him. Family only. I'm her father. She checked the chart. Room 312. Daniel hurried upstairs. Ava waited outside. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Finally, Daniel walked into the hallway. His shoulders looked heavier than she'd ever seen. Is she okay? He forced a smile. She will be. But he couldn't finish. Ava gently asked, What aren't you telling me? Daniel sat down. For the first time, his calm disappeared. He rubbed his hands together. Emily has a heart condition. Ava felt the words hit like a punch. What? She was born with it. The doctors have managed it for years. But they think she'll eventually need surgery. Ava whispered, How much? Daniel didn't answer. She asked again, How much? He looked at the floor. About $300,000. Silence. Ava suddenly understood everything. The warehouse jobs, the maintenance work, the janitor application, the second jobs, the old clothes, the tiny apartment, the skipped lunches. It had never been about Daniel. Everything had been about Emily that night. After Daniel returned to Emily's room, Ava remained alone in the hospital parking garage. She couldn't stop thinking. Something still didn't fit. One question refused to leave her mind. If Daniel had once helped design skyscrapers, where had all the money gone? Engineers at Harrison earned excellent salaries, even after years away. He shouldn't have been struggling like this, unless something much bigger had happened. The next morning, Ava drove to Harrison Structural Engineering. The company had been sold years earlier. Only one retired executive still worked as an advisor. His name was Walter Grant. He agreed to meet her when she mentioned Daniel Brooks. The elderly man's expression changed immediately. I've been wondering if anyone would ever ask about him. You knew him? Walter smiled. Knew him. He was the brightest engineer I'd hired in 30 years. What happened? Walter looked out the window for a long moment. You remember the Riverside Hotel collapse? Ava nodded immediately. Everyone did. It had been national news nearly 14 years earlier. A partially completed luxury hotel had suddenly failed during construction. Hundreds of workers had been inside. Walter slowly continued. The newspapers blamed faulty steel. But that wasn't true. Ava frowned. What was true? Walter opened an old archive box. Inside, he removed a faded engineering report, then quietly slid it across the desk. Daniel Brooks, lead structural reviewer. Ava stared at the signature. Walter's voice became softer. Daniel discovered that a subcontractor had secretly replaced certified materials with cheaper ones. He reported it, but before inspectors could shut the project down, the building failed. Ava's heartbeat quickened. My God. Walter nodded. Daniel went back inside. He helped rescue 17 trapped workers. He nearly died himself. Ava whispered, I never heard his name. Walter gave a bitter smile, because someone else took the credit. Ava looked up. Who? Walter slowly spoke one name, Richard Hale. Ava's eyes widened. The same Richard Hale who now works for me. Walter nodded. He wasn't your executive back then. He was the subcontractor's project manager. He blamed Daniel for the disaster, destroyed his reputation, and when the investigations ended, he quietly built his own career. Using Daniel's silence, Ava felt sick. She finally understood. Richard hadn't been suspicious of Daniel. He'd been terrified that the one man who knew the truth had walked back into his life, across town. Richard sat alone in his office. His phone rang. The CEO has been asking questions about Riverside. His face went pale. So, he whispered, he's finally talking. But he was wrong. Daniel had never said a single word. The past had begun speaking for itself. Monday morning arrived with an unusual tension inside Sinclair Properties. Employees sensed something had changed. The CEO had canceled every executive meeting. Board members had flown in unexpectedly. Outside the glass conference room, whispered conversations echoed through the hallways. No one knew why, only Ava did, and so did Richard Hale. Richard hadn't slept. The moment Ava began investigating the Riverside Hotel collapse, he knew the past was catching up. For 14 years, he had built a spotless reputation. Executive promotions, industry awards, magazine interviews. People called him a visionary, but every success rested on one lie. One man had carried the blame. Another had accepted the praise. Richard had always believed Daniel Brooks would never return. Now he was working 3 floors below him, pushing a janitor's cart. At 9:00 a.m., the board of directors gathered. Ava stood beside the presentation screen. Ladies and gentlemen, today's meeting isn't about quarterly profits. It's about integrity. The room grew silent. She pressed the remote. The first slide appeared. Riverside Hotel investigation. Several board members exchanged confused looks. One finally asked, "What does a 14-year-old construction accident have to do with this company?" Ava answered calmly, "Everything." For the next 30 minutes, she presented documents, engineering reports, insurance records, court filings, email archives. Each document revealed another piece of the truth. Then came the final slide, a photograph. A younger Daniel Brooks, standing beside structural blueprints. The room became quiet. Ava looked directly at Richard. "Would you like to explain why this man's safety reports disappeared before the investigation?" Richard forced a smile. "I have no idea what you're implying." Ava clicked another slide. An archived email appeared, sent 14 years earlier from Richard Hale to the subcontractor. "Destroy Brooks' inspection report before state auditors arrive." The room froze. Richard's face turned white. "That's been manipulated." "It hasn't," Ava replied. "Our legal team recovered it from the federal archive." Another board member spoke. "Richard, is this authentic?" He couldn't answer because he knew it was. At that exact moment, Daniel was downstairs, completely unaware. He was quietly polishing the marble floor near the reception desk. Sandra smiled. "Morning, Daniel." "Morning." She handed him his usual coffee. "On the house." He thanked her. Just another ordinary morning, or so he believed. Upstairs, Richard stood. "This is ridiculous. You're ruining my career over something that happened years ago." Ava's expression never changed. "No. You ruined your own career when you blamed an innocent man." Another board member asked quietly, "What happened to Daniel Brooks after Riverside?" Ava answered, "He was blacklisted. Every major engineering company rejected him. He sold his home, sold his truck, worked temporary jobs, raised his daughter alone, and never once tried to destroy the man responsible." Silence. One director slowly removed his glasses. "My God." Meanwhile, Ava's assistant entered the conference room. "There are reporters downstairs." Ava nodded. "Good. Let them wait." She turned back toward Richard. "You spent 14 years protecting your reputation. Today, we're protecting the truth." Within an hour, Richard Hale was escorted out of Sinclair Properties, not by security, by the same board members who had once admired him. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He simply walked through the lobby carrying one cardboard box. Employees watched silently. As he passed Daniel, their eyes met. Richard stopped for a long moment. Neither spoke. Finally, Richard whispered, "You could have ruined me years ago." Daniel looked at him calmly. "I wasn't trying to ruin anyone. I was trying to move on." Richard lowered his head for the first time in years. He understood the difference between winning and being worthy without another word. He walked out of the building that afternoon. Ava called every employee into the atrium. Nearly 600 people gathered. Janitors stood beside executives, receptionists beside vice presidents. Everyone waited. Daniel remained near the back, still wearing his maintenance uniform, still holding his cleaning gloves. He had no idea why he'd been asked to attend. Ava stepped onto the small stage. "When I became CEO, I promised to build a company based on character. I recently realized we failed someone who had already been living that value." She looked toward Daniel. "Mr. Brooks, would you please come forward?" The crowd turned. Daniel hesitated, then slowly walked toward the stage. Whispers filled the room. "That's the janitor." "What's happening?" Ava waited until he stood beside her. Then she faced the employees. "This man once saved 17 construction workers. by refusing to ignore a dangerous structural failure. He later lost his career, not because he failed, but because he refused to lie. The room became completely silent. She continued, he became a single father, worked whatever job he could find, never asked anyone for sympathy. And when he came here, he asked only for honest work. Ava paused, but that's not why I'm proud to know him. She smiled. I'm proud because after life took almost everything from him. It never took his integrity. Several employees quietly wiped away tears. Even Frank, the veteran janitor, lowered his head. Ava turned toward Daniel. I offered you a management position. You refused. I offered you an executive role. You refused. So today, I'm offering something different. She handed him a small envelope. Daniel opened it slowly. Inside was a simple letter. Director of Safety and Structural Integrity. He looked up, Ava. She smiled. This role wasn't created for you. It was created because of you. It ensures every building we own, every employee who works inside, and every family connected to this company will always have someone who values lives more than profits. The atrium erupted into applause, not polite applause, the kind that comes from genuine respect. Daniel stood quietly, almost overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. Ava answered softly, then don't. You've already spent your whole life saying it with your actions. 2 months later, Emily underwent heart surgery. Daniel refused to ask anyone for financial help, but he never received the hospital bill. When he questioned the administrator, she smiled. It has already been paid. No donor name was listed. Daniel knew immediately, that evening. He knocked on Ava's office door. You did this. She looked up from her paperwork. I invested in someone who has spent his whole life investing in others. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. I can't repay you. Ava smiled warmly. You already did. 20 years ago, when you taught my father that success means nothing without character. 1 year later, the 3rd floor of Sinclair Properties had changed, where an old storage room once stood. There was now the Brooks Safety Innovation Center. Young engineers gathered there every week, not to learn formulas, but to learn responsibility. Above the entrance, a single bronze plaque carried one sentence. Buildings are measured by steel. Lives are measured by character. Every new employee stopped to read it. Few knew who wrote it. Daniel preferred it that way every afternoon. At exactly 3:15, he still left the office, not because he had to, but because some promises mattered more than meetings. Emily, now healthy and smiling, still waited outside her school. She still ran into her father's arms, only now. He no longer worried about tomorrow. Because after years of quietly carrying everyone else's burdens, life had finally returned something to him. Not fame, not revenge, not wealth, something far more valuable, a future. And as Daniel and Emily walked home together beneath the golden evening sky, Ava watched from across the street with a quiet smile. Some people spend their lives searching for heroes. She had hired one. The remarkable part was never that he walked in asking for a janitor's job. It was that he never stopped being the man he had always been. The world had simply taken a long time to notice. The world had simply taken a long time to notice.